Hello everybody, welcome to another video, and in today's concise update we're looking at a whole host of advances beginning with Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia. We have even faster advances compared to previous uploads. We're then going to look at the Kucheriv Yar Pocket, specifically clarity on the line of contact and where there is still some fluidity. We'll then zoom in on the northern flank of Siversk, including the Zaporizhzhia forest and the entrance into the village of Yampil. Then we'll finish off by looking at Ukrainian counterattacks in Sumy. So as we do this all, massive shout outs to the latest channel member, Super Doggy, and please like, share, subscribe to help boost us in the algorithm. Now, as you guys can see over here, the Russian forces are just continuing to advance nonstop. On a daily basis, there are recorded pushes over here, and this is due to the fact that the Ukrainians lack the necessary static defenses built in such a way to absorb a Russian attack coming in from the east. We can see the main vectors of Russian assault at this point in time are from lines of villages, these horizontal chains of villages. So for instance, they took over Kucheriv in the northwestern corner of Donetsk, and since then it served as a forward operating post for the 57th Motor Rifle Brigade and for adjacent units like the 36th Brigade. And they've pushed along that same steady line, took over Ternove, Berezhove, and now they reached a paved road, which includes Kalonivske, and have already arrived at Verbove. And then you can see the same thing manifest over here. The Russians took over Novosilka and then advanced along a paved road and captured in unison various other villages, including Zelenopola, Timarivka, and arrived at Novoivanovka, of course, with the supports of the southern and northern flanks that allowed the Russians to create these cauldrons and firing bags that necessitated a Ukrainian withdrawal. And the Russians can pounce upon that because the Ukrainians lack the necessary fallback lines over here. They don't have a lot of defensive depth. We look at their fortifications that were built over here, and they were meant to absorb attacks coming in from the south. You could see it very clearly that it was built in this sort of semicircle meniscus shape in order to absorb an attack coming from, for instance, Malonivka, but there was no anticipation of a push from, say, Velika Novosilka or Komar or anything of the sorts. And so, yes, there were still defenses, but they weren't built with a composition that can actually absorb assaults from that said direction. Because in this case, the Russians are just taking over the defenses piecemeal fashion, taking them over one by one and sort of biting at it from the eastern edge instead of having to deal with a full blunt force of the defense by attacking from the south. So in that way, not only have the Russians been able to bypass many of the defenses, you could see them highlighting that in yellow, there are so many gaps where you don't even have any trenches, any detaining ditches of a unified sort, but even the ones that do exist, they are simply insufficient. So now I'll close it because it's very cluttered, and you can see here in terms of the units deployed that they are not of a high caliber. Yes, it's true. Over the past 2 weeks, the Ukrainians have deployed reinforcements to here. And I was sounding the alarm for weeks before the Ukrainians actually did have the initiative to do and actually initiate this change on their own. But they did move in 154th Brigade and a couple of other territorial defense units. I'm going to click on them so you guys could get an idea of what I'm referring to over here. And I suppose the most notable redeployment, which happened a couple of months ago actually, before we saw these Russian advances on a daily basis, was the 110th Mechanized Brigade. So they are likely the highest caliber unit along this entire part of the front line. And then a bit to the north, they have the 31st Brigade, which is also of a pretty high standard. But besides that, you're looking at battalions, separate battalions or territorial defense brigades, not necessarily what you'd want in this situation where you want to find a way to compensate for the fact that there aren't enough fortifications. And the best way to do so would be through proper infantry that can man tree lines and experienced drone crews. So the Ukrainians don't have either of those over here. But now let's get into the advances. The Russians are closing in on the Yanchor River Valley across a very broad front now, meaning it's going to be hard for the Ukrainians to stop all of these vectors of attack. At least one of them will be able to infiltrate. I will posit at this point all of them will. And yeah, that's going to spell the end for a lot of these villages on the western side of the river. Now, you can see over here, the Russians captured 13.4 square kilometers south of Volhivske. The capture of Volhivske was pivotal because post-September 15th, the 114th Motor Rifle Regiment had free reign to storm all these other fields over here where the Ukrainians simply lacked any sufficient manpower or defenses of any kind. So whatever forces were deployed to this region had to withdraw to Poltavka. There's a famous clip of a Colombian soldier, and I don't know which unit he was affiliated with, maybe the 110th TF Brigade or maybe the 154th Mechanized. It's one of those two probably. and he was on his own. He was isolated in one of these tree lines. He was essentially somebody who fell through the cracks and was unable to withdraw in time. So he served as a sort of vanguard for the rest of the Ukrainians. And then, of course, he raised up the Colombian flag and he was killed by the Russian side. But at this point, the Russians have been able to take over this sort of flanking area that can be used to close in on the Yancho River Valley and on the eastern approaches to Poltavka, in addition to, of course, the pressure that exists to the south where you have Malanivka. So you can very clearly see what's going on over here. As a result, though, you have this other salient that is formed to the east of Okhotnichny over here. You can see this open field, and it's rather, it sticks out. It's bulging at this point, and the Ukrainians are holding out for the time being, but it's just naturally been created due to the Russians' own initiative, pushing with a really deep penetration in this particular region along one particular tree line in order to get very close and to knock on the door of some of these Ukrainian-controlled villages. So looking at the advance in a diagonal manner, we could see that they've been able to push 7 or 6.5 kilometers northwestwards. It is a significant advance. Now to the south of Nova Ivanivka, we can see that they captured 2.5 square kilometers, the Russians. They're getting very close to reaching the Yancho River over here and thereby separating the southern chunk of the river valley and, everything that goes along with it, all the defense lines, because, you do have some trenches that were dug. They're very thin, but they were dug on the eastern side of the river. And I don't know if that actually is shown on the map, on the fortification map over here. So I'll turn it on for a moment so you guys can see what we do have on here. Yes, some of it is actually mapped. You can see it over here. Some of the fortifications have already been overrun by the Russians. Some of them are not even shown because they are so thin and sort of new compared to when this was done. This map was completed by Playfair, for instance. And so the satellite imagery does not always account for that. But on the ground, there were some defenses. In terms of who's manning them, that's another problem. It's so close to the front line, and Russian artillery has been very active recently that it becomes really difficult to hold on. And so most Ukrainian soldiers, if they are at the front line, they're going to try to hide in basements instead of defending in those above ground positions. Over here, the Russian advances do allow them and opens up an opportunity to reach Novovasilivske and Novomykolaivka. So those two villages are also under intense danger right now. To the north, you have this advance of about 3.9 square kilometers. The Russians are getting very close to Novomykolaivka, as we all anticipated, using Novoivanivka as a springboard, because before the capture of Novoivanivka, there was a massive gap in between the previous organization points for the Russians, those being Tamarivka and then Zelenopole and Novopil. And then at a minimum, they pushed about 6 or 7 kilometers to the west. But for the most part, if you're looking at like the largest Russian nodes, they were able to push about 12 kilometers to the west and establish a new forward outpost through which assault companies can organize and then branch out. So we've seen that over here with this advance, meaning that Novomykolaivka is now within the crosshairs of a Russian advance in order to allow the Russians to then take the fields to the south of it, through which they'll attack Uspanivka and various other villages near the northern bend of the river valley. Here's another really interesting advance. To the northwest of Kalinivska, the Russians captured 9.86 square kilometers of territory. Again, advancing along this one narrow paved road, it seems as if even in this concentrated area, where usually Ukrainian drone crews would be, really good, really well versed in halting an attack, in concentrating all of their efforts on one specific area in order to deny the Russians a vector of advance. But over here, they were unable to stop it, and the Russians were able to make it all the way to Verbove. And only at that point was the 110th Brigade redirected from their positions slightly to the north in order to shell and to conduct FPV strikes targeting these Russian forces as they were trying to seep into the village. So now it's contested, and we'll have to see if the Russians can actually gain a foothold here, a permanent one, and take it over. Because at that point, it spells, a lot of consequences for the Ukrainian bulges to the south, because the Ukrainian salient that you see over here, it's sort of sticking out, as you can see. It's not based around or anchored around any village, meaning that it's going to be very difficult in the long term for the Ukrainians to hold out in this area that's probably like 30, 40 square kilometers worth of land. So that could actually fall into Russian hands, and then the entire Yancho River line will be in danger. But not just that, but also areas in Dnipro Oblast further to the west will also be in danger. That's not mentioning Stepove, which some Russian sources claim has fallen into their hands. I can't be sure of that, but by the way, the diagonal advance is about 8 kilometers northwestwards by the Russians over here, so really deep advance. But north of Berezhove, there's been a slight Russian advance, 1.4 square kilometers, as there is a level of Ukrainian resistance to the south of Voronezh, Khoroshchi, and Sosnivka. There are some holdouts over here, I'd assume from TDF units, like, for instance, let's open them here, 157th Battalion, 15th Battalion of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, 17th National Guard Brigade, also active around here. So they have just a couple of small squads and, elements of platoons that are holding out in these tree lines. And the Russians, instead of just sulking about it and getting bogged down, clearing them out, they're just bypassing them because there's nothing the Ukrainians can do besides hold on to their own positions. They can't be proactive in their initiatives over here. So the Russians just hop from village to village, from stronghold to stronghold, and then leave the Ukrainians behind in these really deep salients that eventually are either get encircled and then the Ukrainians have no way out, or the Ukrainians themselves have to admit that it's unfeasible to remain, and it naturally closes. The salient naturally constricts. So that's been the story of this part of the front line for the past couple of weeks. And we could see naturally how it's going to continue developing, as we talked about. Looking at the area west of Pokrovsk, the Russians have been able to advance north Udachny and essentially take over the entirety of its outskirts. So about 1.36 square kilometers of territory captured, including the western edge of Udachny, some of the northern roads, and some of the warehouses as well. So there is now an effort to dislodge the Ukrainians from a lot of the positions they've been embedded in for basically a year now. It's almost been a year since they've first taken these positions up as defensive posts. And now they're finally getting pushed out of some of them. But they have numerous other ones that have not been dislodged due to the fact that the Ukrainians do have a lot of defensive density over here and prepared for it. They also have a tightening garrison of forces from, the 3rd SSO Regiment and 59th Brigade. And the Russians, again, are not investing all of their efforts into this particular area. Also, the Ukrainians don't have to worry about their flanks over here. It's a pretty sort of flat line. But you can see there are numerous defenses between the T046 road and then to the north, the E50 highway. And so that's what the Ukrainians are really banking on. And then, of course, you have these massive mines and factories that have to be overrun. So there's a lot of work to do from a Russian perspective, but they have been able to also progress to the west of Kotline, capturing 1 square kilometer of territory. This video from the September 27th shows that the 1111 Strike Battalion conducted strikes, FEV strikes, on the Russian-controlled dugouts right next to the Pokrovsk Zaporizhzhia ventilation shaft. So that appears to be some sort of industrial facility, and it's associated with the mining network over here, and there may also be an underground component to it, but it was overrun by the Russians, and at this point, the Ukrainians from the 152nd Brigade are just targeting them in kind. And that's also one of the key units involved in the recent defensive actions heralded by the Ukrainians. By either way, we are seeing externally an uptick in the pace of Russian advances over here. And I would say, again, keep an eye out for the western flank of Pokrovsk, because even though we don't have anything official to talk about today from that region, it continues to be, an ever-present rumor that the Russian DRGs are trying to exploit that particular part of the city. Now, the eastern approaches to Myrnohrad are continuing to fall deeper and deeper into Russian hands. Here we can see 3.52 square kilometers of territory captured, and an advance westwards amounting to about 2.5 kilometers. So it is rather deep. On September 26th, the 3rd Battalion of the 79th Air Assault Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry in houses and fortifications near Dnipro, which appears to be like a eastern sort of district of the city. So you can see it over here. I'm going to mark it with this sort of red perimeter. The Russians are getting very close to actually getting foothold in these houses. And once they do so, it's going to jettison the process of actually expanding deeper. Because right now it's an issue. The Russians are organizing the results from Novoekonomichny and then have to advance through open areas with a lot of mines, and Ukrainian drone crews are extremely active over here for 3 kilometers without any sort of cover. So finally getting some level of safety via the cellars, via the dugouts and basements, would be a positive development for the Russians, and it would put further strain on the Ukrainian salient that remains in control of some sections of this mining facility. To the north, we now have clarification on what's going on in the Kucheriv Yar Pocket. There's a video here that was released by the Phoenix FPV group, I would like to show their unit over here on the map. I don't know if I'll be able to find it because I have so many of them, but they are active around here. And they conducted FPV strikes onto shelters and tree lines near the storage facility and the Dorozhny clay mine, which you can see is present to the east, or just to the east of the town, and also to the east of the rail line. So you could see that there were 3 motorcycles destroyed, 1 ATV, 1 car, 2 loafs, an ammo depot, or multiple perhaps, and then 1 T-80. They were all destroyed due to the initiatives of this drone team. But in the process, we also were able to prove that the Russians advanced over here. Now, this is where a debate begins, because the narrative that I've been largely subscribed to, and that Radov's been mentioning, and a lot of Ukrainian sources as well, is that the Ukrainians were able to begin, say, around early September, their counterattack to retake Nikhanorivka. And then from there, in recent weeks, perhaps over the past week and a half, they've been able to expand that into Zatishok, trying to push over there, and into Boykivka, and in addition to the advance from Volodymyrivka to Novotoretsk. Now, some Russian sources claim that this never happened, and that there was simply a lull in fighting, and that sort of the fighting died down and became more fluid, and the amount of forces, the amount of DRG crews just gradually died down around a front line that was based along this line over here that you see. It's just that we do have some level of video evidence to back up the fact that there were Ukrainians operating over here, and some Russian sources were talking about it, not all of them. So that's why I was inclined to say this. But yes, it is true based on satellite imagery of fires and of the craters caused by Russian FAB strikes. And there wasn't anything like extremely intense that could be noticed in Nikhanorivka or to the southeast of it. But either way, I was sort of going with the consensus over there. But regardless, what appends all of that is the fact that we have a new video that's come out that's geolocated to Dorozhny, indicating that either the Russians were always there or that they've been able to retake positions south of Novoshachove. And in this case, it would be an advance of around 3.5 kilometers and 6.5 square kilometers, meaning that if there are Ukrainian forces in Nikhanorivka trying to cut off the supply line to Kucheriv Yar's Pocket, which I suppose spans now 1.9 kilometers, so it's very thin and basically runs along a couple of paved roads and local routes that are basically along the Kazany Turets River line. Now, if it is the case that the Ukrainians are still here, then they are also in a sort of cauldron formation, and it's about 1.5 kilometers in width. And that's where the fluidity gets into this, because even though we have these corridors marked over here, I'm sure that the Ukrainians, like in theory, they can move forces across this field over here if it need be, and there wouldn't be like a massive grouping of Russian forces over there at ground zero to stop them. And that's why everything over here is very rough and why there is still fluidity. But regardless, we do know the Russians now have additional positions in tree lines near some small ponds and to the south of Ivanivka. So that's important. It has reduced some of the strain onto the supply lines in the Kucheriv Yar Pocket, especially if Nikhanorivka can be taken over. If that's the case, then that will be crisis averted for the Russians, because then they'd only have to focus on the Kazany Turets River line. And so it will be interesting to see whether reinforcements were deployed, whether the 110th MRB is the only Russian force involved in this recent push, or whether some of the Marine brigades are also involved, because we now know that all of the Marine brigades have been deployed, including 336th. You have 40th over here, you have 61st, you have 177th, and there may be another one that I'm forgetting, but yeah, you get the point. A large contingent of naval infantry forces were moved, and you could see the one I forgot is the 155th. Some of them are operating on the eastern flank of the Kazany Turets River, and we'll get to that in a moment. Others may be serving as reinforcements for the Kucheriv Yar Pocket. In the process, are alleviating some of the issues the Russians were experiencing. Now, looking to the east of Volodymyrivka, or rather to the north of Rusyn Yar, we have this massive salient that's been closed. About 9.8 square kilometers of territory has been taken over by the Russian side, running along these ponds over here and adjacent tree lines. This video from the 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade shows grenade drops and FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers northwest of Rusyn Yar. And now the front line has sort of been straightened out. This massive Ukrainian salient that spanned all the way, I suppose if we're going to measure it, it spanned like about 5 or 6 kilometers to the south. It was a massive thorn in Russia's back, and prevented them from focusing their entire contingent of forces on a uniform advance northwards or westwards, because they had to deal with this massive sort of configuration of the front line that was unfavorable to like on the ground front line contact between their forces. But now that process is going to become much more streamlined. And so, again, we should be keeping an eye out for this eastern flank, because it is an imperative for the Russians to just close out this Ukrainian sort of leverage factor that they have over there that continues to put a strain on Kucheriv Yar all the way south to Novotoretsk. And I believe, by the way, that this advance recently was led by the 40th and 155th Marine Brigades. They were the ones involved in that. To look at Serebryansky Forest and Siversk, we can see over here that there's been another video, or rather not another video, but just another geolocation from an earlier video showing that the Apache drone unit of the 81st Air Assault Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto dachas in Rudnik, which is a micro-district to the north of Siversk. It spans this area over here, basically. So the Russians have taken over most of it, meaning they have the necessary positions, including in basements, to then push southwards and actually reach the northern outskirts of Siversk. So we have this route from Serebryanka itself into Rudnik, and then there's another route along this paved road. And then from there, there's sort of a hook northwards before they arrive at the houses. So as long as the Russians can now consolidate that, they will have a very strong starting point before they actually begin storming the city itself. And we can see with the fortification map that they have indeed been able to bypass a lot of the defenses built by the Ukrainians without much fanfare. Now, over here, we can see that in Yampil, the Russians have been able to take over what amounts to 7.4 square kilometers. Again, a really important advance. Essentially, all of the fields and the final remaining houses in southern Torska have been taken over. And moreover, the ostrich farm over here was taken over by the Russians. And they've used this route along the rail line to then disperse their forces in groups of 3 to 4 and storm into Yampil itself. So they are now located in this sort of beachhead in the northeastern part of the town. The Ukrainians are resisting from the 11th Army Corps in the southeastern parts, or southwestern, parts of the town. And I would say notably from the 54th Mechanized Brigade and also 53rd. And so we have this video over here from the 11th Army Corps. It's from September 28th of FPV strikes onto a wounded Russian soldier. He was being evacuated by another Russian soldier, and he was moving him in a wheelbarrow. So the two of them were struck as they were trying to seek refuge. And so that gives us an indication that the 11th Corps is active around here. Which relevant units are part of the 11th Corps that operate around here? The 81st and the 54th. So even though I have them closer to Siversk, it's certainly possible that they are now operating in Yampil as well. And that's a problem, because they should have their full focus on Siversk due to this northern flank being so weak and so tenuous at this point. So keep an eye out for Yampil, for the storming of it, but also for the storming of some of the forests that are sort of sandwiched in between Zaporizhzhia and the bulge into Yampil, because that will spell the end for, first of all, the village itself, but also for the entrance points into Liman, which are very important, as we all know. And I do want to finish off with Sumy. So let's look at the advances by the Ukrainians over there. We can see that they've been able to turn the tide near Kinrashivka. So their advance amounts to 1.95 square kilometers of territory. And it's to the northeast of Kinrativka in this case. So there's a reservoir. It's called the Kinrativka Reservoir. They're very close now, the Ukrainians, taking over its entire southern coast or entire southern bank. And the Russians, in this case, they were striking the Ukrainians in the Zolotarivsky district or Zolotarivsky Park. And you can see that over here due to a video from the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade using Molnia 2 kamikaze drones striking tree lines in this reservoir region. The advance vertically amounts to about 2.15 square kilometers of territory, meaning the Ukrainians are only, if we're measuring in a best case scenario, 400 meters away from the border between Kursk and Sumy. So they're getting very close in this particular region. And that's why the 810th Brigade was redeployed after it was rotated out a couple of weeks ago in favor of the 30th Regiment. But obviously the unit can't hold on its own, so they needed the support of the beleaguered 810th. And I say that because, they've been exhausted over here for a pretty long time, but they have not received the necessary amount of recuperation since they were withdrawn. And Oleksivka is still in this very tenuous situation because the Russians do hold over here. And it's impressive that they've been able to retain control for this long. But the Ukrainians have a very strong western flank, and it's continued to expand. And the eastern flank is also notable near villages, like well-established villages, like Varichny and Novomykolaivka. But regardless, the Russians do know that it's imperative that they hold on to Oleksivka, because if the tide ever turns, if the Russians are able to stall the Ukrainian advances, and then one day decide to go back on that fence over here, having this anchor in Oleksivka will make it so much easier, because then they'll have the flanking opportunity to close in like this, as you can see. So losing that would just make the process 10 times harder. But yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.